I filed the after-action report in 17 minutes, which is fast for me. Usually I take my time. I check the numbers twice. I write clean sentences. I leave nothing ambiguous for whoever reads it next. But that night, if you can call it night when you are parked above a planet whose dayside fills your observation ports from edge to edge, that night I filed it quickly because I did not want to sit with it any longer than I had to. The report said, Responding Vessel Ardent Meridian, Heavy Rescue Frigate, Earth-registry, Captain M. Solek commanding. Arrived Remnant Reach Station at 11:47 hours ship time, 31 hours and 44 minutes after the initial distress beacon. Provided engineering assistance, fuel cell transfer, and surgical support. Departed at 3:19 the following morning. No escort, no authorization from the Reach Council, no formal request received from any human command structure. Responding vessel acted on its own discretion. That last sentence is the one that got me 2 formal inquiries and 1 very long conversation with Admiral Hess, who is not a shouting man, but who has a way of being quiet that is somehow louder than shouting. I am not sorry. I want to say that plainly before I say anything else. I have been a rescue frigate captain for 11 years and I picked up that signal and I went. That is the whole of it. Everything else is detail. But the detail matters, so I will give it to you. We were 3 days out from Callaway Station, running a standard patrol leg through the Venn corridor, a stretch of deep drift space that sees enough commercial traffic to warrant the occasional presence of a rescue hull, but rarely enough distress to make the work exciting. My crew of 41 was in the comfortable rhythm that long patrol legs produce. The overnight shifts were quiet. The day shifts were maintenance and drill, and Chief Engineer Davo Prank had taken it upon himself to rewire the secondary water reclamation unit in Bay 4, which had been giving us a soft alarm for 6 weeks, and which Command had listed as a low-priority repair item. Prank does not have much tolerance for low-priority designations when the item in question is dripping. Lieutenant Commander Essa Valk was on the bridge when the beacon came in. She logged it at 2:33 hours and woke me at 2:37. 4 minutes is fast for Valk. She is methodical, not excitable, and she does not raise a captain before she has looked at a thing from 2 or 3 angles first. I remember that my cabin was cold. I had let the climate system drop it down before sleep. I pulled on my jacket and looked at the beacon data on the tablet she'd sent to my bunk terminal, and I stood there for a moment in the blue half-dark with my jacket half-buttoned, reading. Aethon Quorum Emergency Frequency. Distress Beacon, Class 1, which is the highest classification, the one that means structural failure or life support compromise, the one you do not send unless you mean it. The beacon had been running for, I checked the timestamp, 31 hours and 8 minutes by the time Valk logged it. 31 hours. I sat down on the edge of my bunk, and I read the beacon's embedded packet, which carried a compressed situation report from someone identified as Senior Arbiter Sarathon of the Aethon Remnant Reach. The situation report was brief, because by the time they sent it, the station's communications array was already degrading. A reactor cascade in the station's lower processing core had triggered an emergency shutdown across 2 of the 3 primary power rings. Life support was on reserve cells. Propulsion was offline. The station was not a ship in any practical sense, but its orbital stabilization thrusters kept it from drifting into a decay spiral, and those thrusters were now running on the same reserve cells as life support. Internal temperature had dropped 14 degrees. The station's medical bay had 11 critical cases, 7 of them from the initial cascade explosion, and 4 from exposure-related complications in the hours since. The station's population at the time of the cascade was 612 individuals, primarily council staff, ceremonial cast, and the administrative apparatus of the Quorum Sector Authority. 612 people on reserve cells, losing temperature, with 11 critical cases, and a communications array that was getting quieter by the hour. and the beacon had been running for 31 hours. I buttoned my jacket the rest of the way and went to the bridge. Valk was standing at the navigation table when I arrived. She had the sector chart up, and she had already plotted our current position and Remnant Reach's orbital track. The line between them was not short. She had also, because she is Valk and she thinks ahead, pulled up the response log for the beacon, a summary of all vessels that had acknowledged the signal and either responded or declined. She let me read it without saying anything. The Reach Council had acknowledged the beacon at hour 2. Their response, logged at hour 3, was a formal statement that the sector surrounding Remnant Reach Station had been designated a quarantine buffer pending investigation of the Cascade event's cause, and that no vessels would be cleared to enter the buffer zone until the investigation committee had convened. The committee was expected to convene within 72 hours. 3 other vessels in commercial range had logged acknowledgement of the beacon. One had responded that its cargo manifest precluded a diversion. One had responded that it lacked the engineering capacity for reactor-related rescue work. One, a mid-tonnage hauler, I noted, had not responded at all beyond the acknowledgement log. The Reach Council's quarantine order was still in effect. Valk said, "They're on hour 31. The reserve cells on a station that size run for about 50 hours under standard life support load. If they've been compensating for the temperature drop with additional heating draw, call it 40. 40 hours total, 9 of those already spent. Approximately. And that's before you factor in the 11 critical cases in their medical bay, which will draw power from the reserve cells at a rate that shortens the window." I looked at the distance calculation she had run. Ardent meridian at best sustainable burn, not sprint burn which stresses the frame, but best sustainable, would cover that distance in approximately 14 hours. 40 minus 31 minus 14, I said. We arrive with roughly minus 5 hours of margin. She said it the way she says most things, which is calmly and without embellishment, but her eyes were doing something particular. Unless they've been conservative with their heating draw, in which case we have perhaps 3 to 4 hours to spare, or unless the reserve cells are rated higher than standard. We don't have the Quorum's technical specs. What's our fuel cell inventory? 12 Type 7 cells in reserve cargo. We loaded them at Callaway for the Morrigan Station handoff next week. The Morrigan Station handoff was a scheduled resupply run for a small human outpost on the far side of the corridor. 12 Type 7 cells would keep Morrigan Station's secondary systems running for 4 months. They would also restart a crippled station's power ring. I thought for about 15 seconds. I am aware that 15 seconds is not very long for a decision of this kind. In my defense, the situation had a certain clarity to it. Plot the intercept course, I said. Best sustainable burn. Wake Prank and Dr. Ferrara, I want them briefed before we make the turn. And send an acknowledgement on the Aethon emergency frequency. Tell them we heard them and we're coming. Valk was already entering the course correction before I finished the sentence. She said, without looking up from the navigation table, "The Reach Council quarantine order." I read it. We would be in violation of it. I know. I'm not arguing, she said. I want it in the log that I raised it. Noted. Log it. She logged it. Then she completed the course plot and engaged the burn sequence. An ardent meridian came around in the dark of the Venn corridor and pointed herself at a star she had not been pointed at 20 minutes ago. I have been asked, in the 2 formal inquiries and in the long conversation with Admiral Hess, whether I considered requesting authorization before diverting. The honest answer is no. I considered it for approximately 3 of my 15 seconds, and then I stopped considering it. The Reach Council had already decided what they were going to do, which was nothing, and any authorization request I sent up the chain would have moved at the speed of bureaucratic procedure, which is not the speed at which reserve cells deplete. I want to be fair to the Reach Council. Their quarantine order was not, in strictly procedural terms, unreasonable. A reactor cascade in a council station is a serious event, and the question of whether it was an accident or something else is a reasonable question to ask before sending vessels into the area. The problem is that the 612 people on the station did not have 72 hours to wait for a committee to convene and deliberate and issue a clearance. They had, by Valk's calculation, somewhere between 3 and 9 hours of margin after our arrival, assuming we arrived at all. I also want to be fair to the commercial vessels that declined. Reactor work is specialized. If you do not have the equipment and the trained people, going to a crippling cascade event does not help the people on the station. It adds your vessel and crew to the problem. I did not think less of them for declining. The hauler that logged the acknowledgement and then said nothing, I thought less of them. But that is not something I put in any report. What I put in the reports is the sequence of events, clearly and in order. What I am putting here is how it felt, which is a different document entirely, and one that no inquiry board has ever asked for. It felt for most of those 14 hours of burn like a very simple thing. Someone had called for help. We were the only ones going, so we went. Prank spent the first 4 hours of the transit going over Remnant Reach's reactor schematic, which Valk had pulled from the Public Technical Registry, maintained by the Quorum's Engineering Bureau. He came to my cabin at hour 5 with the schematic on a tablet and a mug of tea he had brought for me without asking, because Prank has been on my crew for 6 years and knows my habits, and he laid the tablet flat on my desk and talked me through what he thought had happened and what he thought we could do about it. The cascade had originated in the lower core's secondary regulation array, a known fragility in the Quorum's older station designs. Apparently, there had been a technical bulletin about it issued 3 years prior, and Prank had found a reference to it in the registry's maintenance archive. The fix was not, in itself, complicated. The difficulty was that the damage to the regulation array had also corrupted the control pathways to the primary power ring's restart sequence, which meant that you could not simply bring the ring back online through the normal console procedure. You had to go into the physical junction relays, bypass the corrupted pathways manually, and reinitialize the ring from a clean signal source. "We can do it," Prank said. "We need 3 people in the relay chamber. It'll take 4 to 6 hours, and we need the station to have enough cell power left to hold life support while we work. That's the pinch. If we arrive and they're already pulling from the last 20% of reserve, we won't have enough working time. What do we need from them to make it work? I need their station's chief engineer in the relay chamber with us. I need someone who knows the system's quirks. And I need to know which relay banks are salvageable before we start, so I'm not diagnosing cold. We'll try to raise them as we close distance, and their array can pick us up." Dr. Adiz Ferrara, who had come in while Prank was talking and had taken the chair in the corner of my cabin in the manner of someone who has already been awake long enough that sitting down is a biological priority, said, 11 critical cases. "Yes," I said. "In a Quorum medical bay, which will have been designed for Quorum physiology. The equipment will not be calibrated for." She stopped. "Do we know what kind of critical cases?" The packet mentioned explosion injuries from the initial cascade event and exposure-related complications. "I don't have more than that." She nodded slowly. She was already doing what Ferrara always does, which is to work the problem in her head before she says anything out loud. She is a small woman with very steady hands and the habit of extreme quiet when she is thinking. She had served on 2 planetary disaster response ships before transferring to my crew, and she does not rattle easily. "Explosion injuries and cold exposure complications," she said. "Most of what I can do for those is standard enough to translate across species. Respiratory support, thermal stabilization, Wound management. The specifics of the anatomy will be unfamiliar, but the principles will hold. I'll need one of the Quorum staff to translate their medical records, and I'll need access to whatever stabilization agents they have in their own bay. I won't have the right compounds in our supply for their specific physiology. Understood. I'll make sure that's in the first communication we get through to them. She stood up, gave me the look she gives when she considers a meeting concluded, and went back to her ward. Prank picked up his tablet. What about the quarantine order? Not your problem, I said. He nodded once, which is Prank's version of a full conversation on the subject. He finished his tea, set down the mug, and went back to Bay 3 to review the fuel cell transfer equipment. I sat alone in my cabin for a while after that. The planet was not visible from my viewport on this heading. We were pointed at deep space, at a set of coordinates that contained, at this moment, a station I had never been to, a species I had interacted with perhaps 4 times in my career, and 612 people running out of warmth and power in the dark. I thought about the beacon running for 31 hours before we found it. 31 hours. What does that feel like from inside? You send the signal and you wait, and the frequencies come back empty, and the reserve cells tick down, and the temperature drops another degree, and you send the signal again, and the frequencies come back empty again. 31 hours of that. A full rotation of most inhabited worlds. Long enough for a committee to convene, apparently, and decide that convening is enough. I have pulled people out of situations before. Damaged haulers, failed drive frigates, a passenger transport with a catastrophic pressure loss in the aft section that had killed 6 before we arrived, and would have killed 40 more if we hadn't. You learn something from that work about what the last hours feel like from the inside, not because anyone tells you, but because you see it in the people when you get there. You see it in the way they move when the airlock opens, in the sound their breath makes, in the particular quality of stillness in their faces before anything has been said, when they are just looking at you, and understanding that the thing they had begun to believe would not happen is, in fact, happening. I had never pulled Aethon personnel out of anything. I knew the species by registry data and by 4 brief professional encounters in 6 years of patrol work in the Venn Corridor region. The Quorum is an old species. The registry notes indicate several thousand years of recorded council history, and they carry the characteristic affect of old species, which is a kind of deliberate gravity, the assumption that anything worth doing is worth doing with appropriate ceremony. In the 4 encounters I had logged, the Aethon I dealt with had been precise, formal, and patient in a way that felt less like courtesy, and more like a deeply ingrained understanding that haste is usually a symptom of inadequate preparation. I wondered what 31 hours of silence did to that gravity. I wondered if Serathon was still formal. I suspected he was. Some people hold the formal posture tighter when things are bad because it is the last thing they control. I am not by nature a person given to anger. My crew would tell you I am even-tempered to a fault. But in that cabin alone I was angry, not at any individual or institution I could name precisely, just at the 31 hours, at the weight of that number. At the response log on Valk's console, the Reach Council's procedural statement, the cargo manifest declination, the mid-tonnage hauler that had logged an acknowledgement and then gone silent. At the arithmetic of it, how many vessels had been within range of that signal in 31 hours, and how many of them had looked at the response log and the quarantine designation, and decided that their particular situation did not permit a diversion. I understand that reasoning. I have used versions of it myself in other circumstances, but the circumstances here were not ambiguous, and the cost of the reasoning was a station getting colder by the hour and 11 people in a medical bay and a reserve cell counter ticking down. I filed the anger away and went to check on the burn calculations. We raised remnant reach station at hour 11 of the transit when we were close enough that our signal could punch through the degraded state of their communications array. The contact was scratchy and intermittent. Their array was running on reserve power too, and there were gaps in the transmission, but it was enough. The voice that answered was not what I expected, which is to say that I had expected someone frantic, or frightened, or desperate. The voice that answered was none of those things. It was formal, and it was tired, but it was composed with a kind of careful deliberateness that I would later learn was characteristic of the Aethon ceremonial caste under duress. They did not abandon formality when things were bad. The formality was how they held themselves together. "This is Senior Arbiter Sarathon of the Aethon Quorum Remnant Reach Station. Please identify your vessel and your authority." I identified myself in Ardent Meridian and said, as clearly as the transmission would allow, that I was on approach and that I intended to render assistance. There was a pause. Not a long pause, a few seconds at most, but in that pause I heard something that I have thought about since. A sound that was not quite a word, in a voice that was doing its best not to be a voice that had been holding itself together for 31 hours and had just heard someone say they were coming. Then composed again. "Captain Salek, you are aware of the Reach Council's quarantine designation." "I am aware of it." Another pause. "This vessel is not a Quorum vessel." "No. We're Earth-registry, heavy rescue frigate." "You are very far from your patrol assignment." I had not told them my patrol assignment. They had, apparently, identified Ardent Meridian in the registry and pulled our posted route during the seconds of silence between transmissions. I found that I liked them for it, the impulse to know the details even when the details hardly mattered anymore. "We heard the beacon," I said. "We came." The transmission broke up for several seconds, and when it resolved again, Senior Arbiter Sarathon said, in a voice that had lost some of its formal evenness, "You are the only vessel that has responded." "I know. The Reach Council." "I know what the Reach Council did," I said. "I'm not the Reach Council. I'm a rescue frigate and I have fuel cells and an engineering team and a surgeon, and I am approximately 3 hours out. I would like to begin coordinating with your station's engineering chief now if we can hold the signal long enough. My chief engineer needs to know the condition of your relay banks." The pause this time was longer. I could not read it. I did not know then the Aethon well enough to read their silences. I know it better now. "Then I will connect you to Chief Technician Vorsolith. One moment." The transmission clicked, and there was static, and then a different voice came on, rougher, more clipped, with the particular cadence of someone who has been awake for 31 hours managing a catastrophe and is running almost entirely on urgency now. Prank pulled his chair up to the console and took over the channel, and for the next 2.5 hours, he and Vorsolith talked the relay banks. I left them to it and went a stand at the observation port. Remnant Reach Station appeared on my visual at hour 13 of the transit, a dark shape against the planet's dayside glow, which was extraordinary, actually. The planet below was a banded gas giant with a ring system that caught the local sun at a shallow angle and scattered it in long amber lines across the upper cloud layer. The station floated in that amber light and did not look, at this distance, like it was dying. It looked like something someone had placed there deliberately, for the beauty of the view. As we closed, the beauty gave way to detail, and the detail was worse. 2 of the station's 4 external power conduit towers were dark, meaning the power rings they connected to were cold. The stabilization thruster clusters on the station's equatorial band showed uneven firing patterns, which meant the orbital correction system was struggling. A section of the lower processing core's exterior paneling had been blown outward by the initial cascade, and the debris field around that section had been drifting for 31 hours, which meant it had spread into a loose shell of metal shards and insulation material that we would have to navigate carefully on approach. Lieutenant Osai brought us through the debris field at a speed that made me very glad, not for the first time, that he was my helmsman. He did not use the proximity alerts. He watched the field on the visual and navigated by eye, making small corrections with the maneuvering thrusters in a series of adjustments so smooth and precisely timed that we came through without a single contact. "Clear," he said, which was all he said. We brought Ardent Meridian into docking range on the station's secondary bay. The primary bay's pressurization system was down and extended the docking collar. I was at the airlock when it sealed. What I remember about the first few minutes on the station is the cold. I had dressed for it, we all had, after Valk's briefing, but the cold on Remnant Reach was a particular kind, the cold of a large space that has been losing heat for 31 hours and has had no source to replace it. It was not the sharp cold of stepping outside into winter. It was the heavy, still cold of a space where warmth has simply been leaving, gradually and without drama, and what remains is the absence of it. The docking bay was dim emergency strip lighting only, pale and blue-white, not enough to fully illuminate the space. 2 Aethon station crew were waiting at the inner airlock door. They were tall, taller than I had expected, though I should have anticipated it from the registry data, and covered in close-lying feathers that ran from deep gold at the crown and neck down through graduated bronze tones to a dark, almost brown coloration at the wrists and ankles. In the dim emergency lighting, the feathers had no particular luster. They looked like people who had been cold for a long time and were holding themselves carefully because of it. One of them spoke in accented but clear standard, "Captain Solek." "Yes." "I am 3rd Coordinator Len. Senior Arbiter Sarathon requests that you come directly to the observation level. He asks me to convey that he would have come to receive you himself, but the upper levels are warmer than the lower, and he is directing the station's heating allocation to concentrate there for the welfare of the injured." I noted that, because it said something I wanted to know about Senior Arbiter Sarathon, a person who, in the middle of everything, had thought to explain to the incoming crew why he hadn't come to the airlock himself, because he didn't want them to think it was discourtesy. "Of course," I said. "My chief engineer and his team will go directly to the relay chamber. Coordinator Len, please have Chief Technician Vorsolith meet them there. My doctor and her team will need immediate access to your medical bay." "I'll go to the Arbiter." The coordinator moved efficiently despite the cold and the obvious exhaustion. Prank and his 4-person team peeled off to the left with Vorsolith, who had come from the direction of the engineering section. A compact, broad-shouldered figure whose feathers were dark with what might have been soot or grease, and who shook Prank's hand with the directness of a person who is too tired for preamble and just wants to get to the problem. I liked that immediately. Prank liked it too. I could tell by the pace at which he started walking. Ferrara went the other direction with 2 of her medics, and a supply cart loaded with everything she had decided, in 14 hours of preparation, that she would need. She moved quickly and without hesitation, and I watched her go for a moment before following Len toward the upper levels. The lifts were off, reserve power was routing around them. We took a maintenance stairwell. In the stairwell, the cold was sharper. It came down from above and pooled at the landings, and I could hear the sounds of the station around us. The distant hum of the stabilization thrusters firing in irregular pulses, the creak of the structure adjusting to the temperature differential, and somewhere below, the sound of many people in a confined space, which is a sound unlike anything else, the sound of 600 people waiting. Len said as we climbed, "You are very far from your assigned corridor." "I've heard that." "The Reach Council's quarantine designation." "I'm aware of the designation." He was quiet for a moment, then carefully, "You came anyway." "We came anyway." Len said as we climbed, "You are very far from your assigned corridor." "I've heard that." "The Reach Council's quarantine designation." "I'm aware of the designation." He was quiet for a moment, then carefully, "You came anyway." "We came anyway." He stopped on one of the landings and turned to look at me. In the dim emergency lighting, I could see that he was not young. The feathers at his face and jaw had a quality of settled density that the younger station crew did not have. And his expression, insofar as I could read it, was doing something careful. "I sent the first distress relay myself," he said. "I was the one on duty when the cascade alarm sounded. I initiated the emergency beacon sequence and I ran the communication burst on all standard frequencies." He paused. "That was 31 hours ago. I have been on duty for most of those hours. I have been monitoring the response log." "I know what the response log showed." "You were not in it until you were." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing. He turned and continued up the stairs. I followed him. He did not say anything after that until we reached the observation level. The observation level of Remnant Reach Station was, under other circumstances, clearly meant to be impressive. It was a wide ring of corridor and chamber space just below the station's upper dome, and the dome itself was a single expanse of transparency, not glass, something tougher with a faint blue tint at the edges, that looked out on the planet below and the ring system and the amber-lit space in all directions. Under full power with the lighting arrays on, it must have been extraordinary. Under emergency lighting, with the dome admitting the planet's ambient glow as the primary light source, it was something different, quieter, larger feeling, the kind of space that an accident of circumstance had made more honest than it was meant to be. Senior Arbiter Sarathon was standing at the dome's main observation arc when Len brought me in. He was old, I could tell that, though the Aethon do not map their aging onto a human timeline. The indicators were a certain stillness in the posture and a quality of the plumage at the face and crown that suggested long years in the same way silver at the temples does in a human. His ceremonial robes, which were the color of deep water, were pristine, which struck me as a remarkable thing in the circumstances, and later I decided it was intentional. The formal appearance as a form of resolve, the same impulse as the formal voice on the transmission. He turned when I entered and regarded me for a moment from across the dim, cold room. Then he crossed toward me and he held out both hands, palms upward, which is an Aethon formal gesture of reception. I knew that from the briefing materials we carry, and he said, "Captain Salek, you came." "Yes," I said. "Alone?" "We're one frigate. That's enough for what needs doing." He looked at me steadily. The planet's amber light came through the dome and caught the crown of his feathers and made them, briefly, look like they were holding their own light. "The Reach Council issued a quarantine designation," he said. "They did. You are in violation of it." "I am." "You knew this when you came." "I did." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, the formal register was still there, but it was doing different work. It was carrying something the rest of his face and posture were also carrying, something I did not want to name incorrectly, so I will just describe it. It was the look of a person who had sent a signal into silence for 31 hours and had understood by the 20th hour that the silence was the answer, and had kept sending anyway because there was nothing else to do, and who was now standing in front of someone who had come. "I would like to understand," he said, "what moved you to come?" I thought about the question carefully because he asked it carefully. Then I said, "We heard the beacon. We had fuel cells and an engineering team and a doctor." The calculation was simple. Simple. He said the word not as a challenge, but as though he were holding it up to the light. "Simple," I said. "You called. We were the ones who heard it and could help, so we came." He looked at me for another moment. Then he turned back to the dome and the view, the planet below, the ring system, the amber light on everything, and I let him have that moment without filling it with anything. Then he said quietly, 31 hours. "I know." 20 of those hours I believed an answer was coming. The 10th hour, the Earth sovereignty sent a message saying they were monitoring the situation. I thought. He stopped. By the 20th hour, I understood they were not coming. None of them were coming. I kept the beacon running because there was nothing else to do. The reserve cells were depleting. The temperature was dropping. The 11 in the medical bay, 2 of them had deteriorated. He turned to look at me. One of them died at hour 28. I'm sorry. His name was Curator Fenvarath. He maintained the station's historical archive. He had worked there for 40 years. He looked back at the dome. The quarantine order was, I believe, designed so that the Reach Council could be seen to have taken a procedural position without committing vessels to an area they considered potentially hazardous. I do not blame them for the caution. I blame them for the 40 years. I did not say anything to that, because there was nothing to say that would have been sufficient. Below us, through the dome, the amber light of the ring system was painting the gas giant's upper cloud layer in long horizontal lines of gold, and the station floated in it, and my crew was already at work in the relay chamber and in the medical bay, and somewhere on this station, 611 people were waiting in the cold. The heating, I said. We have allocated the reserve cells' remaining thermal output to the upper levels in the medical bay. The lower crew quarters are cold but manageable. The injured are stable for now. He paused. Your doctor, she is in the medical bay now. Yes. She'll need assistance from your medical staff. She doesn't have the correct compounds for Aethon physiology, and she'll need someone to translate the case records. I will send Physician Tervolan immediately. He speaks standard. Thank you. He crossed to the communication console on the far wall. It was live, running on the reserve power allocation to the upper level, and spoke briefly in Aethon formal dialect. Then he returned to the observation arc. Captain, he said, may I ask you something? Of course. Earth. The Council of Planets does not consider Earth he searched for the phrasing, a consequential world. We have reviewed Earth's registry data. Your fleet is not large. Your territory is not extensive. You are, by the measures the Council uses, a minor species in galactic terms. He said this without cruelty, the way a scholar states a fact. Why would a captain of a minor species rescue frigate violate a Reach Council quarantine order to respond to an Aethon distress beacon? I thought about that. I thought about the 15 seconds in my cabin and the 31 hours and Prank with his schematic and his tea and Ferrara's steady hands and Osai threading the debris field without a proximity alert. We don't have a large fleet, I said. We don't have a lot of territory. We don't have a particularly grand place in the Council's rankings. I paused. We do have rescue frigates. We have them because somewhere in our history we decided that when someone calls for help and you can get there, you get there. It's not a policy position. It's just what we do. Sarathon regarded me. What we do, he repeated. Yes. He looked back at the dome. Prank found the relay bank situation worse than the schematics had suggested, which is how it always goes, and better than the worst case, which is also how it always goes. Vorsolith walked him through the station's particular configuration. There had been a refit 6 years prior that had not made it fully into the technical registry, and 2 of the relay banks that Prank had planned to use as the clean reinitialization source were, in fact, non-standard. But Vorsolith knew the refit intimately and knew which banks were viable and which were not. And together they improvised a bypass configuration that Prank told me later was genuinely interesting. Technically speaking, which from Prank means he respected it. The fuel cell transfer took 2 hours. Moving 12 Type 7 cells through a docking collar and into a station's reserve power bay is physical work, and my crew did it efficiently and without complaint, even in the cold. When the last cell was locked in, Vorsolith ran the confirmation sequence, and the reserve power readout on the station's bay console jumped. not to full capacity, but to a level that gave the life support and heating systems enough margin that Valk's window calculation became, abruptly, no longer the crisis it had been. The relay chamber work took 4 hours and 40 minutes after that. Prank was down to his last junction when the primary power ring's reinitialization signal finally took. He described it to me afterward as a moment that went from deeply uncertain to done in the space of about 30 seconds, and Vorsolith, who had been next to him the entire time, apparently said something in Aethon that Prank could not translate, but that he said sounded the way relief sounds in any language. When the primary ring came back online, the lighting on the upper levels shifted from emergency strips to the full arrays, and the dome above the observation level lit up properly for the first time in 31 hours, and the view of the planet and the ring system and the amber light on the gas giant's clouds was, I imagine, rather spectacular. I was in the medical bay with Ferrara when the lights came up. The medical bay was warm. We had ensured that in the first hour, and Ferrara had been working steadily since she arrived. Physician Tervolen had met her at the bay entrance with the case records, and a thoroughness of information sharing that Ferrara had told me in a brief break was exactly what she needed. He was young, by the indicators I could identify, and he worked alongside her with a kind of focused urgency that matched hers without any of the usual friction of two professionals from different traditions trying to establish a working hierarchy. They had simply looked at the cases together and divided them by what each could most effectively do, and they had done it. Ferrara told me later that the Aethon medical case records were the most meticulously maintained she had seen outside of a major human teaching hospital. Every reading, every intervention, every compound administered, every complication, logged with timestamps and annotated with the attending physician's reasoning. 40 years of Quorum medical practice had produced a documentation standard that she said she was going to bring back to our own medical log protocols, because it was simply better. What she did not say directly, but which I understood from the way she said everything else, was that the records had also made it possible for her to work as quickly as she did. Without the records, she would have spent the first 2 hours diagnosing, estimating, proceeding with extreme caution because she did not know the physiology well enough to move fast. With the records, and with Tervolen explaining what was current and what had changed in the hours she wasn't there, she could move at the speed the cases required. I watched her work for about 20 minutes before I understood something about rescue medicine that I thought I had already understood. The quality of the preparation is the quality of the rescue. Ferrara had spent 14 hours on our transit preparing. Every compound she had selected, every tool she had loaded onto the supply cart, every protocol she had reviewed or modified for the differences she anticipated. All of that was why she could walk into an unfamiliar medical bay and start helping people in the first 30 minutes. The rescue doesn't start when the airlock opens. It starts the moment you turn the ship around. There were 10 cases left when I arrived. The 11th had been curator Fen Varath, who had died at hour 28 before we got there, and whose absence sat in the room without being spoken of. Ferrara had brought 2 critical cases into stable condition. 3 more were being actively managed. The remaining 5 were serious but not immediately life-threatening and were being monitored by Tervolen's team. When the lights came up and the temperature on the bay's climate display shifted from the emergency reading to something warmer, Tervolen looked at the display for a moment and then looked at Ferrara. "Your engineers," he said. "Yes," she said, without looking up from what she was doing. He made a sound that I did not know the Aethon vocabulary for, but that I understood anyway. The station's heating cycle came to full function at roughly hour 8 of our docked presence. The temperature in the lower crew quarters, where the 611 had been waiting in the managed cold, came up to a habitable level, and the crew of Remnant Reach Station moved through that transition in a way I observed from the observation level, where Aethon and I had been talking for most of those hours. We had talked about a great many things. He was a deliberate conversationalist, unhurried even now, and he had a way of asking questions that made you feel the question had been carefully chosen, not improvised. He asked about Earth's rescue service, how it was funded, how frigates were crewed, how long the typical tour of service was, what the training looked like. He asked about the Ardent Meridian's patrol assignment and how far we were from our posted route. He did the arithmetic on that quietly. I had asked him about the Aethon Quorum, their history with this station, the nature of the sector authority they administered from here, the archive that Curator Fenvarath had maintained for 40 years. He answered all of it without evasion, and with a clarity of detail that told me the Quorum's council elders are expected to know everything within their administrative purview, not as a matter of vanity, but as a matter of genuine responsibility. We had not talked about the Reach Council. We had not talked about what came next. When the heating had stabilized and the lower quarters were habitable again and the lights were on, and the power ring was running steadily on the Type 7 cells, Aethon stood at the observation arc and looked at his station below the dome, lit now, functional, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What will happen to you when you return for the quarantine violation?" "An inquiry or two," I said. "A conversation with my admiral, some paperwork." "That is all." "Probably. The outcome was positive. Inquiries after positive outcomes tend to be shorter than inquiries after negative ones." He turned to look at me. "And if the outcome had been negative, if you had arrived and we had been beyond saving?" I thought about that honestly. Same inquiry. Longer conversation with the admiral. "And you would have come anyway?" It wasn't a question, but I answered it. "Yes," I said, "we would have come anyway." He regarded me for a long time after that. The amber light on the ring system had shifted as the planet rotated. It was more golden now, warmer in tone, the shadow of the planet's larger moon crossing the upper rings. "I have a question," he said, "that I have been formulating for several hours and that I want to ask correctly." "Go ahead." "The Reach Council's quarantine order. You knew it. You violated it deliberately. You did this for people you had never met, of a species you had had little prior interaction with no authorization from your own command, at risk to your vessel and your career, and potentially your crew." He paused. "None of the species with greater capacity, greater proximity, or greater formal relationship with the Quorum came. Earth sent one frigate, unauthorized, from a patrol route a 14-hour burn away." He paused again. "I want to understand the model, the framework by which this is the correct thing to do as you understand it. I'm not asking to be polite. I am asking because I genuinely want to understand." I thought about it for a while, because the question deserved it. Then I said, "Someone called, we could get there. Those are the two pieces. Everything else you're describing, the authorization, the quarantine order, the prior relationship, the capacity comparisons, those are the variables that the model is supposed to output. But someone called and we could get there. That's the input. The output follows." He was quiet. "I don't know that I can make it simpler than that," I said. "I don't believe it is simple," he said. "I believe you have presented a simple expression of something that is, in fact, very complex. The conviction that someone called and we can get there constitutes a sufficient warrant to violate a council quarantine order and burn 14 hours across a patrol corridor. That is not a simple premise. That is a premise built on something." "Maybe," I said. "We don't examine it much. We mostly just do it." He almost smiled. I could not be certain. The Aethon facial register is not the same as ours, but there was something in his expression that was proximate to it. "Your species," he said, "does not appear in the Council's consequential tier because your fleet is small and your territory is modest and your diplomatic history is recent. By the Council's measures, you are not yet a significant presence in galactic affairs." "That's accurate." It may be, he said carefully, that the Council's measures are missing something. I did not say anything to that. I did not need to. We undocked at 3:19 station time. Prank's team had run a final check on the relay configuration and left Vorsolith with a complete written account of the bypass procedure, annotated in technical standard with Aethon terminology where they had established common ground, so that the station's own engineers could perform the same work without external assistance if the configuration needed adjustment. Ferrara had brought all 10 remaining cases to stable or managed status, and had written a full clinical summary for Tervolen's team covering every intervention she had made, and every compound she had used or recommended, because she said it was the correct thing to leave for the record. Prank's team brought the 12 empty Type 7 cell housings back aboard. The cells themselves were now integrated into the station's reserve power system, and the housings were ours to return to the supply inventory at Callaway. I would need to explain to Morrigan Station that their scheduled resupply was going to be late and partial. I was not looking forward to that conversation, but it was a manageable problem. I was at the docking collar when Serathon came down. He came alone. He had dismissed the coordinator and the other staff who had been present, and he came to the docking collar airlock by himself in the dim corridor. The lighting was full now, but the lower levels were always less decorated than the upper, more functional, and in the functional lighting he looked older than he had under the dome. He held out both hands, palms upward. "Captain Solek," he said, "on behalf of the Aethon Quorum Remnant Reach Authority, I acknowledge what you did here." "Noted," I said. "The Quorum will formally log a debt of honor to Earth-registry vessel Ardent Meridian. This debt carries reciprocal obligation under Quorum treaty law. Should your vessel, or any vessel carrying Earth-registry, require assistance that lies within the Quorum's capacity to provide, that obligation will be honored." "I appreciate that," I said. "We didn't come for the debt." "I know," he said. "That is why the debt is real." I looked at him for a moment. He was composed again, formal again, the arbiter rather than the man who had stood at the dome for 31 hours sending a signal into silence. But the man was still there behind the arbiter's face. "I hope the archive is intact," I said. "Curator Fenverath's archive." Something moved in his expression. "The power cascade did not reach the archive vault. It is intact." "Good." He nodded once. I stepped back through the docking collar, and the seal engaged behind me. An Ardent Meridian undocked from Remnant Reach Station and moved out through the debris field. Os brought us through clean again, with the same smooth patience, and the station grew small in our aft visual, and then the burn engaged and it was gone. I filed the after-action report in 17 minutes. Then I sat in my cabin and looked at the viewport, which showed deep space and the fading glow of the planet at the edge of the frame, and I thought about Senior Arbiter Serathon standing at the observation dome for 31 hours, keeping the beacon on because there was nothing else to do. I thought about Curator Fenverath and his 40 years. I thought about Prank and his annotated bypass procedure, which he had spent 2 hours writing by hand because he wanted the Aethon engineers to have it clearly, and about Ferrara's clinical summary for Tervolen, and about Osai threading the debris field without a proximity alert because he was Osai, and that was simply what he did. I thought about the Reach Council's committee, which would convene in approximately 60 more hours and deliberate carefully and issue a clearance, and about the Orth Sovereignty's message at hour 10 saying they were monitoring the situation. The ship was quiet around me. The crew was in the post-operation rhythm, the slightly flatter, more exhausted version of the work rhythm, when the urgency has passed and the body remembers that it has been at high function for 14 hours and then 8 more. It is not a sad quiet. It is the quiet of people who have done the thing and know it and don't need to say so. My console lit with a message from Valk. Short, it said, Admiral Hess is aware of the diversion. Expect contact in approximately 6 hours. I have prepared the preliminary response package. Also, Morrigan Station is asking about the resupply. I have drafted an explanatory message for your review. I sent back, thank you, Essa. She sent back, of course. That was the whole conversation. I turned off the cabin lights and sat in the dark, which was not really dark because the gas giant's reflected light still caught the edge of the viewport in a faint amber line. I looked at it for a while. The Reach Council's measures had put us in a particular tier: small fleet, modest territory, recent diplomatic history, not yet a significant presence. Aethon had said, "It may be that the Council's measures are missing something." I had not answered him, because it was not the kind of statement that needed answering. But sitting in my cabin in the amber half-dark, I thought about what the answer would be if I had given one. We are small, we are recent. We don't have the fleet or the territory or the history that makes the Council's matrix click over from minor to consequential. We probably won't for a long time. But we have rescue frigates. We staff them and we fuel them and we send them out on patrol legs through corridors like the Ven, and when a beacon runs for 31 hours without an answer, we hear it. We hear it because we are listening. Because we decided, somewhere in our history and without a great deal of formal deliberation about it, that listening was the right thing to do, and that when you hear something and you can get there, you get there. That is not a policy position. It is not a treaty obligation. It is not a calculated diplomatic play. It is, I think, the thing the Council's tier matrix does not have a column for. I turned off the cabin lights and sat in the dark, which was not really dark because the gas giant's reflected light still caught the edge of the viewport in a faint amber line. I looked at it for a while. The Reach Council's measures had put us in a particular tier: small fleet, modest territory, recent diplomatic history, not yet a significant presence. Aethon had said, "It may be that the Council's measures are missing something." I had not answered him, because it was not the kind of statement that needed answering. But sitting in my cabin in the amber half-dark, I thought about what the answer would be if I had given one. We are small, we are recent. We don't have the fleet or the territory or the history that makes the Council's matrix click over from minor to consequential. We probably won't for a long time. But we have rescue frigates. We staff them and we fuel them and we send them out on patrol legs through corridors like the Ven, and when a beacon runs for 31 hours without an answer, we hear it. We hear it because we are listening. Because we decided, somewhere in our history and without a great deal of formal deliberation about it, that listening was the right thing to do, and that when you hear something and you can get there, you get there. That is not a policy position. It is not a treaty obligation. It is not a calculated diplomatic play. It is, I think, the thing the Council's tier matrix does not have a column for. I thought about Aethon's question, "What moved you to come?" I had given him an answer, and it was an honest answer, but it was not the complete one. The complete one is harder to put into words and is also, I think, the kind of thing that sounds like a speech when you say it out loud, and I do not make speeches. The complete answer is something like this: we are a young species in galactic terms, and we remember what it was like to be alone. Not in the abstract, in the actual, historical, recorded sense of alone, of looking out at a sky full of signals from other civilizations, and not knowing whether any of them had any interest in whether we lived or died. That period in our history shaped something in us, some instinct or understanding that I do not have a clean word for, that made us decide when we did finally get out among the others that we were going to be the species that heard the beacons, that responded to the signals, that came. It is possible that this is a choice that will, in time, cost us something we cannot afford. It is possible that there will be a beacon we cannot answer, or an arrival we cannot get to in time, or a quarantine order from a council with more authority than the Reach Council that we cannot simply ignore the way I ignored this one. It is possible that the accounting will not always come out where pranks did. But I do not think we will stop listening. I do not think we will stop going. I sat with that for a while. Then I closed my eyes and the amber light was still there on the inside of my eyelids, very faint, and I let myself sleep. The beacon was not running anymore. We had answered it, that was enough.